I got a lot of notes, and we'll see what we can do. But today we're going to do an overview of the book of Joshua. We're going to give people a couple more minutes to sign in and see how they're doing and everything. But Joshua's
come on, you stupid thing. Why don't you stay up there for more than 2 seconds?
Joshua's kind of a military conquest book, and so it has some interesting things in it as well. But we're going to be taking a look at it and going into the land today to possess the promised land. So that'll be fun. All right. What time is it? Can anybody say a clock?
2 o'clock.
All right.
2:01.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you and appreciate the opportunity to come together to study your word. I thank you for your Bible. I thank you for the book of Joshua. I thank you that Joshua is the Hebrew equivalent of the name of Jesus. And so as we look at a few things here in this book, God, we can make some really big parallels to where we are today and things that we need to be aware of. And so, Father, we thank you for that. I thank you for all of these wonderful people who are taking part of their afternoon to study your word, and pray that it will bless them and that it will guide them into your truth. And Father, that we will have a good time celebrating you and learning about you. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Yeah. So have y'all learned anything lately about God?
He's in control and we're not.
Yeah.
He's in charge. He knows what he's doing. We just have to wait and see.
No, that's true. Yeah, the governor was just on TV a few minutes ago, and I was trying to listen, but I didn't hear anything. So it doesn't sound like we get to go to church yet this Sunday, but I'm still praying that around the 1st of May, we'll be able to meet and gather together again. So let's keep praying for each other and for those who do have the virus, that they'll get well, and that we'll get to our ebb and flow where we've gone over the hump and be able to get together pretty soon, okay?
Sounds good.
All right.
When we get together,
You asked if we've learned anything about God.
Yeah.
I've been reading Ezekiel, and that's a scary book. The wrath of God is a difficult thing. You know,
Yeah.
in the New Testament, it says that it's a terrible thing to fall in the hands of an angry God.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, can't wait till we get to Ezekiel. We'll work on chapters 1 and 2 for a little while. So, can anybody say aliens? Yeah. So, well, we'll find out. So, all right. Well, we're not there yet. So we've finished the Pentateuch, the big 5, the first 5 books, and now we're heading into the writings. And so the writings, you know, there are, I think it's 12 books that are the writings that deal with historical context and information about how God is moving in the life of Israel. And it'll include everything up, you know, through Psalms and Proverbs as well. But as we look at Joshua, Judges, and Ruth will be this next first band, and in those 3 books, we have a lot of good information. So today we're going to look at a few really interesting passages, and I'm going to give you some information, especially when we get to around chapter 10 and the sun standing still, and some fun things to look at there. And so let's go into the land with Joshua and the others, okay? In chapter 1, just begins with God setting up and, if you will, establishing Joshua as the leader of the people. And so Moses has been with the people for 40 years and led them out of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness and got to watch them cross the Jordan. But Joshua is the one who was made leader of the group and got to actually deliver them into the promised land because of Moses' little indiscretion at the Mount Meribah, or the spring where he hit the rock instead of speaking to it and disobeying God's instructions. God chose to keep Moses on the other side. And at the very end of the book last week, Deuteronomy, we talked about Moses' death and how God took care of him. Chapter 34 is all about the death of Moses and everything. And now we switch into Joshua. And so the Lord has installed Joshua. Let me read just a few verses out of chapter 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, Joshua, the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, or we could say Nun, and that way it would destroy my theory that Joshua didn't have any parents. But anyway, Moses' aide, verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, that sounds a little bit redundant, but by the way, my very first sermon at Lone Star Bible Church back October the 22nd of whatever year that was, 17, I guess. I started out with that verse, Moses is dead and leadership has passed on. And I didn't know at the time that Sunday was Dan Hooten's last Sunday. And here I am talking about leadership changing and God using people. And then Scott and Albina find me later and say, oh, by the way, Dan and Janice are leaving and they're moving to Texas. And so they won't be here anymore. And we want you to be our pastor. And I'm like, what? And so now you're stuck with me. So anyway, there you go. That's what happens. It's the way God does things. And so it was the easiest and shortest job interview I ever had, by the way. And Scott still laughs at me occasionally. We're sitting at a restaurant eating breakfast together that following Tuesday morning. And I said, so, Sunday morning sounded a little bit like a job interview. And Scott goes, oh, really? You got that? So, Moses is dead. The leadership torch has passed from Moses on to Joshua now. There are some amazing verses here because God has to reconfirm and then also challenge Joshua to what's going on. And so look down at verse 5. No one will be able to stand up against you all the days of your life. And as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. I mean, that is a big promise, right? Verse 6, be strong and courageous because you will lead these people to inherit the land that I have promised you. All right, that's verse 7. Don't turn from the left or the right. And we're going to find out just a few chapters down that one of their people did that and they lost the battle because of it. Go down to verse 9. Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Have I not commanded you this? Don't be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And of course, wherever they're going is the place that God had already promised them. They're going into the promised land. And now, finally, 40 years later, you have that whole generation being passed away. And now they're coming into the land finally to inherit it, right? And then I think now it's about time for me to share my screen real quick, and so let's do that. And for those of you who have video, you'll be able to see maybe. There we go. You'll be able to see my PowerPoint stuff here. So let's find that. Oh, I want that. Where did it go?
Joshua.
Okay. I had to go and find my little thing there. So, all right. Okay, so today they're beginning to enter the land and they're moving over into the promised land. Chapters 1 through 5 deal with them crossing over the Jordan River and starting to do the conquest of everything. They begin with Jericho. Then they're overcoming the land, and we'll be there, and how they're going into it and things that go on, especially the Battle of Ai is one we're going to look at, and then occupying the land, and then faith over victory. There's 24 chapters in Joshua, and so we'll be looking at that as well. Hide that, there we go. All right. So let's go ahead and start talking about entering the land. They're crossing the Jordan. You know, the 12 stones are mentioned. Jesus himself says something about 12 stones. And so it's interesting that we go back and we kind of look at some of the things going on and find out that, you know, when God told them to set up stones and to basically plaster them and whitewash them and write laws upon them, that those stones are still standing. And Jesus talks about them at one time and mentions the stone. And so we have the monument of the 12 stones. Hang on a second, there we go. And so these things were done in Beth-Horon, beyond the Jordan. Now, whenever they say beyond the Jordan, they mean the eastern side of the Jordan River. Well, because when they were given the possession of the land that they were possessing is on the western side of the Jordan River. And so anytime that they had to travel across the Jordan or the Trans-Jordan side, they were talking about, so that's beyond the Jordan on the eastern side, where John was baptizing on the Jordan River. We have Abraham to our father. And for I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up the children unto Abraham. Matthew 3:9. And so what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about crossing the Jordan twice. We're talking about these 12 stones. And then we, before we can enter the land, all of the adult males have to be circumcised. And, you know, that is supposed to happen on the 8th day after birth. And so it will take a lot longer for the older men to recover from that than it does a child of 8 days, right? Also, manna ceases. And so once they cross the Jordan River into the promised land, God is not providing for them every day the manna, all right? And so then we move into the promised land, and now they're having to live off the land and get food for their provision, right? There is a strange visitor that we're going to talk about, the commander of the Lord's host. And it's interesting because when we do talk about that, we're talking about the captain or the commander of the Lord's host. And what is the Lord's host? Well, usually when we talk about that, we're talking about his, if you will, battalions of fighting warrior angels that are at his bidding. And so who is this commander of the Lord's host? Well, we're not bringing angels to the scene, but we're talking about the people of Israel now, the fighting men of Israel, but their commander-in-chief. The interesting thing when you start to look at it, you start to see that, you know, something else is going on here, because some very strange words are spoken. And this is after two spies go into the land and discover Rahab. And Rahab puts them up and keeps them safe. And Rahab, if you will, comes to faith in Christ, and she is saved. And really, if you look at intel of what's going on, there's not much going on there. They don't get any good military intel about what's going on. And so it's like, why did they go in? Well, they went in to save Rahab. Well, why? Because God has a plan for her in the future, and it has to do with the lineage of Jesus Christ. And so now we're back to the commander, the Lord of hosts. And there's this strange little phrase that the commander of the Lord of hosts says, take off your shoes. Now, Joshua has heard the stories from Moses. When Moses first encounters Jesus at the burning bush, he is told to take off his shoes because the ground he is standing on is holy ground. An angel, by the way, an angel is never seen as one who is worthy of worship. An angel will never accept or want worship towards themselves. Well, there's an exception to that. There's one angel. His name is, Lucifer. He wants people to worship him because he thinks he's equal to God. But other than that, every other created being that's an angel knows that worship alone, and by the way, this should apply to us as well, worship alone belongs to God the Father and not to any mortal, not to any angel, not to any other created being at all. Worship belongs to God, right? And so here's a good question for you as we dig into that. Who fought the Battle of Jericho?
Joshua.
God.
Yeah, really, what did Joshua do? He walked.
He led them.
Joshua
He
walked.
was their leader.
Yeah, he led the people. But who really fought the Battle of Jericho? And the real answer is Jesus. You know, I know it
Yeah.
sounds a little bit like, third grade Sunday school where all the answers are Jesus, but this time it really is true, right? And so what's going on? Well, in the Battle of Jericho, you have to understand that, as we begin the conquest of the land of Canaan that God has promised, that there's a lot going on. And so angels aren't worshiped. And so we know that the commander of the Lord's host is Jesus in one of his visits to the planets. And so he's down to instruct Joshua and the troops. And here's the battle plan. You're going to walk around the city of Jericho. All right. So let me just kind of set up the conquest here for the first few chapters. All right. So the conquest of Canaan, first they're going to take Jericho. Then they're going to fail at Ai, and because of sin, by the way. And then they go to the Battle of Beth-Horon, which is one of the big famous ones. And then they're going to divide the land. And so as they divide the land between the tribes, all of this becomes very special. And remember that there are already 2.5 tribes that have requested of Moses before Moses died, before they entered the land, that they wanted some land. And this is because they're seeing it with their own eyes, but they're requesting land on the eastern side of the Jordan River. And we'll get to that again here in a little bit. So, all right, let's talk about Jericho. All right. So Jericho, we have 2 spies that were sent in. And normally the spies that are going in, are doing intel for the commander in chief so that they can come back with information about how they need to proceed to take the city, right? Jericho in the day was one of the best fortified cities in the world. It was a large city, had good structure, good city gates surrounding everything. And so Jericho was a, if you will, formidable challenge to them. By the way, it also just, the name itself means house of the moon god. And so it is one that stands in opposition to God, the God, one God, according to, remember the Shema from last week, love your Lord, your God, right? The Lord our God, O Israel, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And so here is a town whose name is the house of the moon god. And so spies are sent in to, we guess, gather intel. However, were they really spies or witnesses? Because all they did was go in and be sheltered by Rahab. They witness to Rahab, tell them who they are and what they're doing, tell them the stories of God and how God is providing and protecting them. And then they go into the land, right? So as they are entering in, they have marched through, and chapter 3, by the way, is all about them crossing the river Jordan. And verse 15, last half of 15, as soon as the priest who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing and it piled up in a heap. Have you ever seen water pile up in a heap? Well, instead of parting the Red Sea, right, we're at the Jordan River. So all you have to do is dam up the water from the north as it's flowing south, and then everything stops flowing. And so the water is said in verse 15 and then 16, piled up in a heap, and the water flowed from, the water from upstream stopped flowing, and it was a great distance away in a town called Adam, to the vicinity of Zarethan. And while the water flowing down to the Sea of Arabah, the Salt Sea, was completely cut off. And so the water stopped flowing, and that's the place where the Israelites got to walk across the Jordan River. The Ark of the Covenant is held and carried by the priest. And as soon as the priests get to the edge of the water is piled up in a heap. They get to walk out. The Ark of the Covenant goes in front of them and stops in the middle of the river. And then 2 million people, or however many it was at that time, go across from the eastern side of the Jordan across into the Promised Land. And the first big city they come to is Jericho. And so once they get there, they're surrounding Jericho, and Joshua gives the battle plan. And so the battle plan is really not a very good military strategy. They're going to march around the city one day for 6 days. Silent. They don't make a sound. They don't blow a trumpet or a shofar. They say nothing. And that's very important. And then on the 7th day, which, oh, by the way, would be a Sabbath day, they're going to march 7 times on the 7th day. And then at the end, they yell and scream and blow the trumpets and everything, and the wall will fall down. Now, here's an important thing. They're also instructed to take no spoil, no plunder, don't take anything, no accursed thing, because this is the house of the moon god. This is not a city belonging to Yahweh yet. And so they are instructed not to take any spoils of war at all. Nothing. And yet, we go to Ai next. So they do march, the walls fall down, and everything is in good and, pleasant order. So, and then after that, and so anyway, after that, then they go to Ai next. And so as we're looking at what's going on, we find out in chapter 7 that a guy named Achan has sinned before the Lord. Let me turn my page here. All right. And so instead of having confidence and faith in the Lord, the Bible tells us that they had confidence in themselves and their ability. The first time God does something miraculous and all you do is walk around a city and then yell and the walls come tumbling down, right? They're like, well, we're undefeatable. We can do whatever we want to. And so they underestimate the enemy, and 3,000 sufficient? Well, no, they go in and they were routed. They lost 36 men in the battle. And then we found out that it's the only loss of a 7-year campaign. The only time that they're ever defeated in this whole process is here at Ai. And it's because of, a guy named Achan. And the Lord said to Joshua, get thee up, and why are you lying down on your face? Instead of moaning here and crying out to me, you need to get up and get things right in your camp. And that's when they discover that Achan, right, has smuggled forbidden loot. He violated God's injunction that they weren't supposed to take any spoils of war. And he did. He went out with a Babylonian robe, if you will. And so, by the way, it didn't end well for Achan, because he was, and I hate to, just say that it was this complete, but his family and all of their stuff, if you will, was stoned to death. So because of the sin of Achan, his whole family was put to death, and even his belongings were out there, and they were stoned by the people. Now, chapter 8 is a vindication of those things, because in chapter 8, they go back to Ai. And after stoning Achan and his whole family, then they go back for the second attack, and they take 30,000 men instead of 3,000 men with a 5,000 man ambush force, and they totally wipe out the city. So they should have done that on the first try, but they were a little cocky and took a tenth of the men instead of 30,000. They only took 3,000, and they lost 36 people. And it was the only time in that whole 7 years where they were taking and possessing the land that they met with any defeat at all. But it was because of the sin of Achan and him not obeying the Lord. And by the way, Achan, I don't think was just a foot soldier either. I think he was one of the higher ups. And so he definitely knew what was going on. And that's why his punishment was so severe. So chapter 8 gets us to where they go back to the town of Ai and conquer it. And everything is good in that. So the next big battle is chapter 9, and it's the Battle of Beth-Horon. And so the kings and the confederate under Adonai-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, which is interesting. By the way, Adonai is a word that we use as Lord, and so his name is Lord Zedek, and he is the king of Jerusalem. They were defeated in this battle from stones of fire from heaven. And these stones of fire that came from heaven were very intentional in their trajectory. I have a hard time with that word. And where they were placed, and it was just an amazing thing. And as a part of this battle, the battle was running long, and they were running out of daylight. And so Joshua commands the sun to stand still. Chapter 10. Now, Adonai-Zedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it. And so we skip over to verse 9. After an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise, and the Lord threw them into confusion, right? Okay, and so God is helping the battle here, and things are going on that nobody else had ever quite seen, but running out of daylight. And so the sun and the moon extended for an entire day. And so things are going on there. The 5 kings that were associated with this and, under attack as well, they all went and hid in a cave and are dealt with separately. And then to complete this southern strategy, the rest is just mop up, right? So interesting thing, because this has been argued and debated all throughout the centuries. about the sun standing still and how could this be, and all of the, moon and sun charts and everything. And so there are actually 14 different cultures that have a 360 day year, right? We have a 365 day year. And every 4 years, right, we have to make up a day. So there's something that's off by 4 1/4 days somewhere. And so we have leap year to establish that day back. And so every 4 years we add a day, February 29th, to make it all work out. So 14 of the very ancient cultures had 360 day years. And then when we get to the ancient calendars, they all changed in different ways after 701 BC. 701 BC. Well, what happened in 701 BC? Well, we have to go back, and then we're gonna look at that. But in 701 BC, something changed that made everything kind of weird. And so also in 701 BC, we have the Romans. They add 4 1/4 days to their 360, right? So that makes them 364 1/4 days for their year. And so I don't know how you do that on a calendar, how you have a quarter day. We added leap year. And so instead of 365 days, they had 364 1/4 days every year. And they tried to balance it out that way. The Hebrews added, and this is really strange, and I don't know how this works. The Hebrews added a month scheduled 7 times every 19 years. And so there's an extra month that the Hebrews added to their calendar that's scheduled 7 times during 19 years to make it all balance out. Because in 7 years time, in the proclamation of all that in the next couple of, years following up in the 19 years. So every 2 1/4 years, they add an extra month, and that helps them balance it out. So everybody was doing great with 360 days, and then something happened. Well, one of the things that also happened, by the way, is that all of the ancient cultures worshiped Mars. Do you know a whole lot about Mars? Well, we know it's, you can see Mars at different times in our night sky, and it can be one of the brightest stars. Mars and Venus often pass close by, and we can see them in conjunction with each other. All right, but Mars was worshipped. Mars is the god of war, also in the pantheon. And around 600 or so BC, they developed their pantheon of gods, and Mars was worshipped as, the god of war. Well, there's also a nearby hypothesis that puts Mars and Earth in these orbits originally that had, if you will, resonation to it. And they're called resonant orbits. And, the orbit is just how long it takes for a planet to travel around the sun in, a year's time, or however long. The Earth travels around, 1 time a year, takes 365 days. It's 1 year. That's our whole, if you will, trek around the sun. Mars orbit is different. And so, by the way, we have a lot of things that we attribute to Mars, whether we thought about it much or not, much at all, like martial art. Martial arts are, an homage to the god of war, right? And not only was Mars known by, being the god of war, all of the ancients trembled at the thought of Mars and what that meant. And so, by the way, Mars in ancient Greek was Bao, B-A-O, basically. And it was, the god that they feared most, right? And every 108 years, Mars and Earth has a near Pass-By. And it's every 108 years. And so 108 years would be around springtime, and the next 108 years would be around the fall. And so as their orbits, interchange and intertwine, then these things happen. And it has accounted for some catastrophic events on a number of occasions. This whole sonic resonance thing, or resonant orbits, is like if you hit a tuning fork, and you tap it and you hear that resonating vibration. Well, every 108 years, we have things that happen because of these near pass-bys, right? And a lot of it we attribute, to Mother Nature, or, the strange winds that come in off California's coast, and they're called certain things at certain times of the year and other times. And also you can go back in history and look, every 108 years, we have strange climactic changes that happen. And so, by the way, when we speak of global warming, it happens every 108 years. And you can go back and see how warming trends and cooling trends alter every 108 years due to the orbits lining in that close pass-by of Mars and Earth. And so going into that, energy transfers. And so in the fall, it transfers from the Earth to Mars. And in the spring, it transfers from Mars to the Earth, just by that very close proximity of their orbits. And so this all stabilized in 701 BC into what we have now. Before that, it was much different. And that's why the ancients feared, the thought of Mars, because every 108 years, there's some very big climactic changes that were going on. And so a change in its precession is all that's needed. And so when we talk about a precession, it's not a procession, but it's a precession, right? So the precession is the orbiting and the things that are going on. And so what could have changed so many years ago that it finally stabilized in 701 BC? Well, a few PhDs got together and they decided they wanted to talk about the Mars near pass-bys, right? And so you have the orbit of the Earth around the sun. The sun is in the middle. And look, here's Mars. It has a much bigger orbit, and its days are strangely longer. So on Earth, a 360-day orbit, and then on Mars, a 720, so twice as long. And Mars has a much big elliptical orbit than Earth does. But if you look at the two orbits, they're in the same, geographic kind of space and time, right? So in spring, around March the 20th and 21st, you have the inside, right? And so Earth and Mars are at that top point up there. And that's where we lose energy, because we're going ahead, and Earth and Mars. So Earth is gaining energy here from Mars, and Mars is losing energy as we pass by. And I mean, we come within miles of each other in our orbits, all right? In the fall, around October 25th, really close to Larry LeBourne's birthday, it's the other one. Now, it only happens every 108 years, Larry, so you won't get to see two of these. But outside, it's the outside, or the aphelion, and as it passes behind the Earth, and so the Earth, as Mars passes in front of it, the Earth loses energy, and Mars gains energy in the fall, right? And so with all of these strange things going on, three of these PhDs I mentioned, Don Patton, Ron Hatch, and Steinhauer, they came up with this model of Mars near pass-bys. And it goes from being the furthest away from the sun to the nearest to the sun. So the top part in the spring is when we're nearest to the sun, and the bottom in the fall, every 108 years, we're the farthest from the sun, in our orbit as it aligns with Mars. Now, why does this matter and what's going on? Well, not only is it resonant like a tuning fork, these vibrations are pulling or pushing energy from us or toward us, right? And so all of these things are lining up. And so with the resonant orbit, by the way, now look in the bottom right hand, our 360 days have now become 365.25 days because of that push and pull over time. And so now we have a 365-day orbit, and Mars has gone from 620 down to 687. We have pulled energy from Mars so that their orbits are now different and shorter than they used to be. And so by doing that, now you see that we have 365.25 days in our orbit. So in order to make up that quarter day, we add leap year, right? Does that make sense? Everybody heard of a guy named Gulliver? You know, Gulliver and his travels, or Gulliver and his testimony. This is something that Dr. Chuck Missler really loves and pointed out. In early telescope technology, right? In 1610, Galileo discovered 4 moons of Jupiter and Saturn's rings, right? In 1781, Herschel discovered Uranus way out there, you know, as some would say, the last planet in our solar system until they discovered Pluto later. And then poor Pluto, he got demoted and then he got reinstated. And so nobody knows really what Pluto is anymore. 1787, Herschel also discovered 2 moons of Uranus. Excuse me. And then in 1789, he discovered 2 more moons of Uranus, to a total of 4 moons that are traveling around. This is all just through early telescopes that were being made by these guys, Galileo and then Herschel. In 1846, Leverrier discovered Neptune and its 1 moon. And then 1877, and here's the name we need to remember for a while, Asaph Hall discovered Mars had 2 moons, Deimos and Phobos, okay? And so in these 2 moons, Deimos, 30 hours, 18 minutes, almost synchronous orbit around Mars. And Phobos is 7 hours and 39 minutes eastward, and 8 minutes diameter and 3% albedo. And so, which means that it orbits sort of shift and fall, right? So one has a almost synchronous orbit with Mars, and the other one is a very fast moving moon around it and has a much different orbit and is about 3% off. Well, a guy named Jonathan Swift, who lived from 1667 to 1745, wrote a book in 1726 called Gulliver's Travels, The Voyage to Laputa, right? Remember the Laputians, the Lilliputans, right? And these tiny little people, right? He wrote more than one travel, by the way. And the one that we're mostly familiar with is where he goes, Gulliver's a giant who ends up on this island or land of the Lilliputians, right? The little people. The details and size and the revolutions and the orbits, by the way, of the 2 moons of Mars, right? He puts in the book, and if you want to go back and read Gulliver's Travels, it is right there in 1726. And if you look back up above at our chart, that's 151 years before the 2 moons, Deimos and Phobos, were discovered by Asaph Hall in 1877. 151 years before anyone actually knew about these 2 moons. They are in Gulliver's Travels, written by Jonathan Swift in 1726. Now, we have to ask ourselves, you know, what was going on here? And so when Gulliver arrives in the land of Laputa, guess what? They brag to Gulliver, who, by the way, is British. They brag that they know about the 2 moons of Mars and the British don't. And so here in this book that really has become a children's kind of classic, if you will, is this astrological phenomenon that Asa Hall didn't discover until 1877, 151 years after Gulliver's Travel was printed and released by Jonathan Swift. Now, so what does that mean? Well, Jonathan Swift used some models or information, if you will, about this long day theory that messed everything up. And so the long day, what's going on? Well, 1/3 of a million men at Beth-Horon, right? They took, they had a lot of men going around there, 333,000 men in this battle. A lot of them were Hebrews, 1,000 of them. And then, all the others, and they're fighting in Beth-Horon, but, there were 5 kings total that were in this battle, like the Canaanite versions, Hittites and Amorites, that were in there with us. And they were the 5 that went and hid in the cave, right? Well, on October 25th, 1404 BC, Mars was on a polar pass at 70,000 miles, appeared to rise 500 times the size of the moon. And the moon at certain times of the year can come up in the horizon like the harvest moon, and it's really huge as it comes up in the eastern sky. Well, this is 50 times bigger in size. Why? It is on a close pass-by. And so there were severe earthquakes and land tides. We know what tides are, right? You hear about tides, you think of water and how every day the water in the ocean swells and peaks, and we have high tide and low tide, right? Well, there are also severe earthquakes associated with it because there were land tides where the land actually moved. And we still have those happening today, ever so often, and the land only moves about an inch. But when you're back then in those times, and the moon, Mars appears to be 50 times larger than the moon, guess what? Land tides were happening, and so it created earthquakes. And the polar shift of 5 degrees, the day lengthened. And so you have 2 to 3 hours worth of meteors following, and they're coming through the sky at 30,000 miles an hour. And it's included in other ancient legends and folklore. Got to remember this guy's name, Immanuel Vilinovsky, not a Bible believer at all, but he discovered the long night or long day principle and found it included in other ancient legends and folklores. The long night of China. The Chinese have this legend of a long day, and which happened on the other side of the world. So the Chinese legend is a long night, because over in Israel during that time, in 1400 BC, their day is extra long. So on the other side of the world, guess what? Their day is shorter and their night is longer. And so we've got a lot of scientific evidence to corroborate that there's something really did happen, and they've all had to change calendars by 4 1/4 days or 5 1/4 days to make it all work, because everything was already right there. Now, why am I belaboring the point? Because the Bible, with all of this information that we get a lot of people who just hear it and they say, oh, that's crazy. The sun didn't stand still. There is no scientific evidence that tries to explain all of this, but there actually is. And so what was God doing? Well, he allowed the day to be longer, almost another 24 hours, but not quite. He allowed the day to be longer so that this siege, if you will, of Beth-Horon could continue and the Israelites could win. So God gave them extra time. He was sending down big rocks of fire. He was confusing the people, and he made the day even longer. Can you imagine how tired you'd be at the end of that day? Wow. Anyway, and so we have folklore from China saying that they had a long night the same time that the Israelites were having their long day. So it's amazing. All right, so let's continue with the campaign. So watch the map, and as we start looking in the south, we have the conquest of Joshua in chapter 10, and what's going on here at Beth-Horon. And then there's this strange little thing in there, and I know it's kind of small, but it says treaty with the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites deceived Joshua, and they came to him in rags. They had torn their clothes and everything to make it look like they were poor and destitute, and basically gave Joshua a really sad story. And Joshua listened to them and believed them. And so he made a pact or a promise with them that they would not destroy them, but they would come in and conquer, and they would rule, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it was all based on deceit. And so later, when they come to that and the Gibeonites are being attacked by the Ammonites, guess what? Joshua and the Israelites step in to help the Gibeonites because of the promise that Joshua made. Even after he found out that he had been tricked and deceived, he continued with that and helped them in their time of trouble. And then we have the Battle of Beth-Horon in the south, which we just talked about, and see the arrows over there pointing. That's Beth-Horon on the side, and then they go down and see Ai right above that as well. Quick surprise attacks start here, and these are where they go and they just do basically flash bomb attacks, and they just go and just they don't give a whole lot of time for the people to prepare and know that they are coming, right? And so watch for more arrows. They go down, and so they're in this southern campaign, and as you see, they go from town to town, village to village, and they just continue to take over all of the land that God had promised them. Then we move to the northern campaign. All right, so up in north in Joshua 11, King Jabin of Hazor, his alliance. And this is much slower than in the south because it's much more like guerrilla warfare. And so you see how they go up, and then they spread out and they attack these different places and come into power, if you will, right? There's an interesting correlation that some have made between the book of Joshua and Ephesians. Ephesians is about victorious Christian living, right? So in Joshua, we have Israel being represented, and in Ephesians, it's all about the church and God taking care of the church. In Joshua, we have them entering and possessing the land, and in Ephesians, we have the people entering and possessing God's special favor and pleasure in their lives, right? It's all about being equipped and ready for the victorious Christian life. I love the book of Ephesians. In Joshua, we have the earthly inheritance, and in Ephesians, the heavenly inheritance that we are given and what we are expected to have. We're given in Abraham. Through Abraham, the Israelites were getting the promised land, and through Jesus Christ, we are given in Christ everything that we are inheriting through that. And so each book is opened by a divinely appointed leader, right? Each given by grace, received by faith. Even in Joshua in the Old Testament, it's grace, God's grace, that is doing it, but it has to be received. And if you think that a military leader is not having faith, when God says all you're going to do is walk around Jericho 6 days, you're going to walk around the city one time, not say a word, and on the seventh day, you're going to walk 7 times, and on that 7th trip, you're going to scream and cry and hoop and holler and blow your horns and everything, right? That took faith to do that, especially when everybody's up on the city walls heckling at you for this first 6 days. Hey, what are y'all doing? Just having a parade? Each of the sphere of striking divine revelations, right? And so did the people of Israel and Joshua learn about God and his divine appointments? Oh, absolutely. God's promises are true. And in Ephesians, the same thing happens. We learn through that. And each one has a scene of war and conflict. You remember in Ephesians, we're told to take up the full armor of God and to wear, our breastplate of righteousness, our helmet of salvation, and, the full armor, not just parts of it. We need to have our feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. We have our sword, which is the word of God. And we have our shield, which is faith, right? And our belt is girded around us is truth. And so God prepares us for the battle. And Ephesians also tells us that our battle is not from other armies. Our battles are for, principalities and powers that we can't see, and we need to be prepared and girded up for that kind of war. So it's spiritual warfare. Then we also have some similarities and similarities between Joshua and Revelation. Yehoshua is a variant of Yeshua. And so Joshua and Jesus are the same words in Hebrew and then in Greek and Aramaic, okay? And so Joshua is a type of Jesus to come, right? Joshua's a military commander, disposing the usurpers who are against the kingdom of God. And in a 7-year campaign against 7 of an original 10 nations, they defeat everything, and even Ai, they conquer it the second time after they take care of sin in the land, right? The Torah was ignored at Jericho because Jericho, on the Sabbath day, they marched 7 times. You're not supposed to do that, right? It was preceded by silence in heaven for a half an hour. Everyone in heaven, all of the angels, everyone in heaven was silent for a half an hour before the 7 trumpet event happened during the march around. The enemies confederated under a leader in Jerusalem, right? Adonai-Zedek, which means the Lord of righteousness. He was the king in Jerusalem, and they had a confederation of these other 4, if you will, small city-state nations that had gathered with him. So there were 5 rulers, and they were ultimately defeated with hailstones and fire from heaven and signs in the sun and moon, etc., and the day becoming longer. And these kings go out and hide in caves, and oh, by the way, rocks fall on us, and it is all of these things are evident and come to pass also again in the book of Revelation, okay, and have their same and yet different meanings there. All right, so now we're at the division of the land, and so we're moving into not only the land, but here's how the tribes are going to be divided. The tribes were allocated land by casting lots, and this was God's prescription to Joshua, that they cast lots over the land and discover what tribe would go there. Of course, God knew who would end up where. And so Manasseh ends up in the northeast. Remember, before they crossed the Jordan, they said, hey, we want this land over here on the eastern side of the Jordan. And so up on the other side of the Sea of Galilee is Manasseh. Gad is below them, still on the eastern side. And then we get to Reuben that comes down. And then, the Dead Sea is right there in the middle. And then on the western side, at the very top up there, at the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, you have Asher, right? One of the 12 tribes. And then Naphtali is all around. So that would be the area where Jesus grew up, would be Naphtali. Zebulon is right there on the other side, but it's over coastal on the other side, goes all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And then Issachar is up there. And so coming down on the Jordan River on the south, later, Manasseh was split in half. And so Manasseh is right there, what would be the northern end of modern day Samaria during Jesus' time. And Ephraim, the other son of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim, the 2 sons of Joseph, inherit that land to the west of the Nile. And by the way, that's some fertile land over there on part of their thing where they can grow really good crops. Dan was given land to the west there, which would be north of Benjamin and Judah, but Dan also received more land way up north, above Naphtali. Dan also received a portion up there, and the city of Dan, in the tribe of Dan up north, was the northernmost city. And so when you hear from Dan to Beersheba, it's the all-encompassing thing from north to south. Dan is the northernmost city in the tribe of Dan, and also Beersheba is the southernmost city in the tribe of Judah, which extends all the way down to the Negev desert. Okay, after Dan, then you got Benjamin, right? The last son of Jacob, and Benjamin is right there just north of, and it's kind of sits on the dividing line of the divided monarchy, years later after this. And then below Benjamin is Judah, and then Simeon down in the south. Most diagrams I've seen have Simeon sort of as a oblong shape in the middle of the tribe of Judah, and that Judah extends all the way to the south, like I said, to Beersheba and down to the Negev desert. So the complete picture of Israel, right, is all the way from Dan at the very top down through Judah and Simeon down in the south, all the way to the bottom of the Dead Sea down there, all right? The Levites were assigned to 48 cities throughout all of the 12 tribes, basically 4 cities, if you will, of each tribe. 6 of these cities were designated as cities of refuge. And so you'll have 3 cities on the eastern side of the Jordan River and 3 cities on the western side of the Jordan. All right. The cities of refuge or interesting places, and as we talk about them quickly, Israel had no prisons, and so instead of prisons, you had the, if you will, avenger of blood, which is usually a family member who would avenge someone's death if it was murder, capital murder. In cases of manslaughter, however, not premeditated murder, but accidental things, it could even be a fight and whatever, it was secured against the avenger of blood. Okay, so these cities of refuge were places, these 6 cities, 3 on each side of the Jordan, cities that were designated, they were known, everybody knew about them, just in case they needed them. They could go to a city of refuge and hide out there in that city. They'd have to move there and stay there permanently, because if they ever came out of the city, the avenger of blood could take care of that, right? The person. And as long as they're abiding in the city of refuge, the avenger of blood, which was usually a family member of the one who was murdered, couldn't touch them, right? And this prevailed until the high priest died, okay? When the high priest died, everything was set back to normal, right? The person who had committed the manslaughter, they were able to move on and go back to their house or whatever. Now, the high priest, when they were inducted as high priest in the nation of Israel, that was a for life appointment. And when they died, then the next one up, and often it was the son of the high priest, the next one up to become high priest, then that started a new cycle. And so when the high priest died, everything was set back to normal, and people in the cities of refuge could go back and pick up their life in their normal town or whatever, right? The avenger of blood could not take anything out on a family member. It had to be the one who actually did the, thing, right? The manslaughter or whatever, right? And so as long as they lived in the city of refuge, everything was there, right? These are cases of manslaughter, not premeditated murder, right? So also the crucifixion of Christ, right? Was it premeditated or was it manslaughter? Most people would say, oh, it's premeditated. Well, did God know? Yes. Did the people know? No. And so it was kind of really manslaughter in the sense of time of the day. We know, we can look back and, I go, oh, that's premeditated. They knew what they were doing. They didn't know. They may have had hopes that Pilate would condemn Jesus to death on a cross, but they didn't know. And so how secure are we in Christ? Well, we are secure because, oh, by the way, as the high priest, right? Who is our high priest? Well, Jesus was and is and still is. And when did he die? Well, 2,000 years ago, but ushered in him as the king priest. And so now he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and the high priest for all of us. And we are priests under him, according to the book of Hebrews. One interesting thing going on also was the daughters of Zelophehad. And way back during Moses' time, only the inheritance could pass through the sons. Well, Zelophehad had daughters, all daughters, no sons. And so he went to Moses and said, hey, can we make an exception? The Torah exception on rules of inheritance. So it requested of Moses in Numbers 27. And so Moses said, yes, by the sake of the Torah, we can make this exception. Well, here we go. In the possession of the land is granted by Joshua in Joshua 17, right? So interesting thoughts here. So now people who only had, men who only had daughters couldn't have a son to be their, one to pass their inheritance through. They could pass it through the daughter. And so in that ancient culture, a husband adopted by the father of the bride, which is odd when you look at it, but in Ezra 2 and in Nehemiah 7, verse 63, Numbers 32, verses 41 and following, and in First Chronicles 2, 21 through 23 and verses 30 and 35, right? So here a husband is adopted by the father of the bride to make him a part of the family. And so this is one of the ways that we look at how they were doing the inheritance. And so the oldest daughter, when she got married, the husband was adopted by the father of the bride so that he would become his son. And by that way, the inheritance would pass through the son and the daughter. And we see that in at least 4 or 5 different places, right? This anticipates the lineage of Christ and what's going to happen. And so when we get to Luke chapter 3, we'll take a look at what's going on here with all of this. But I want to turn way back to the last chapter of Joshua, chapter 24. And in chapter 24, we have these great verses, right? Let's begin with verse 14, 24:14. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods of your forefathers that they worship beyond the river in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And then you get to verse 15, which is awesome. Verse 15, you need to memorize. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your forefather that served beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But here's Joshua's big statement. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And that kind of sums up everything that the Hebrews to this point are going through. And then also sums up for us, every person, every decision that we make has to be based on that premise. We have to choose. God has provided everything for us, and yet we have to choose Jesus. We have to choose Christ. We are the ones who have to choose the revelation of what God has for us in him. And so let's go to Lord in prayer. Father, I thank you for this day and the time that you have given us. Thank you for the Gospel of Joshua. Even though it's a military book and it's about the conquest of the land, there are so many good nuggets in there and some strange things for us to dwell on as well. But Father, I thank you for those who have gone before me, who have done the time and the research and everything, especially Dr. Misler, and who dilled out, some of these concepts and everything. So, Father, I thank you for that. Thank you so much for Jesus, who is our Savior, and in him we can trust. We have our breath and our being and everything, and we just thank you so much for that, God. And we love you and thank you for this time together. In Jesus' name, amen.